good morning and welcome to the adult Bible class. We are week 33, if you can believe it, and we are just kicking off the Middle Ages. So we had to lay a solid foundation. We actually took the church, if you recall, all the way to the split and kind of talked about the theological differences and political differences that built up tension between the East and the West. And now we've kind of rewound back to the start of the fall of the Roman Empire, because we have to lay a foundation now that it will make sense to us when we get to the Reformation. What did it mean that Martin Luther was a monk? What does it mean when he went on a trial for, and why is it called a diet of worms, or a diet of worms, it looks like in English? What does that mean? Why was this religious leader taken to trial before a civilian court? What did it mean that he was excommunicated by a papal bull, yet his prince of his local territory was providing protection for him? What was the school that he taught at? Was that like our seminaries? So in order to have a context for the truth of all those things, we have to go back and understand what life was like in medieval Western Roman Empire. And last week we had an excellent video that I misjudged the length of, and so we were here about 10 extra minutes. But it talked about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And I left you with several references that hopefully you were able to take a look at over this last week, or you can go back to and take a look at and see what that is all about. And this area of the Middle Ages culminates in a term that's used in church history courses and theology courses known as scholasticism. Scholasticism is this idea that somehow we can approach the revelation of God and understand the revelation of God through mere human reason and through mere human revelation, and that would somehow be sufficient to understand God, to resolve the mystery of Scripture and eliminate mystery. And this theme that we're going to see culminate in the Protestant Reformation happened to Protestants, and it resulted in something called fundamentalism because of this liberalizing dependence on human reason that actually happened in the Protestant movement, especially, again, this area of Europe. So that is what we'll be talking about today. I do have some, we're still in Medieval Roman Empire, Part 2. Some references for you. These are all the same as the last week, with the exception of, I think, Callas and von Dijk, however you say that name, Urban Developments in Late Antiquity and Medieval Rome. And then these are all the same references. So we'll pray and we'll get into the class today. Father, I thank you for your hand. Being involved with the history of your church, being involved in the history of your people, and in the history of the world, Lord, that we can see that you're the one who moves the heart of the king like a stream of water, as your word says, Father, and that we seek to understand how you have shaped and controlled human history in order to glorify yourself, and that we would be able to look at that, Father, and understand the events of history, understand our background and the way that we approach your word. And I ask this in Jesus' name. So we're going to go through two of these three topics today. Next week, we're going to be looking at St. Patrick, only because St. Patrick's Day is that week, and we will have the women of faith in with us. And I didn't think they wanted to, out of the blue, hear a teaching about monks and shaving your head into a crown of thorns and, wearing scratchy woolen robes and sleeping on stones and, fasting and prayer time and all these things. So we'll take a look at St. Patrick and who was he really and what difference did he really make in Ireland. What is this? Have you guys seen Celtic Christianity, that term before? Or I guess if you're from Boston, Celtic Christianity. the knots, that like look like endless loops, the three-leaf clovers, and so we'll talk about that. But this week we're going to cover these first two topics, feudalism and how that opened the door for Viking invasion and what difference that made, and the Anglo-Saxon identity in Britain. The reason these two things are especially important to us as Baptists is our ancestors, our theological ancestors, those people that we could point to and draw a connect line from dot to dot to dot, go back to the time of King Henry VIII when he formed the Anglican Church, when he separated from the Church of England. There were groups called Anabaptists in mainland Europe who were known as the radical reformers. That is not the theological ancestry of the Baptists in America. Our theological ancestry goes to the London Baptists, the separatists, the guys that King James I of England, who is also King James VI of Scotland, who is also the guy that, as a appeasement move, decided to have Anglicans and Presbyterians, or Puritans as they were called, come up and sit together and write a new translation of the Bible. The Baptists were the ones that said, no, we're not using your government Bible. We're going to America, and we're going to start colonies in America where we can have our own scripture. We can have our own separate, not controlled by the Church of England, which is ironic because many independent Baptists absolutely require the King James Bible, but that was the Bible that drove them to America so they wouldn't have to use it. So it is kind of a weird historical irony, which, what do you do with that other than just smile when people start speaking in ignorance? And then we're going to look at the political rise of the church. Again, this is important because how is it possible, for example, when the Pope went to France, to Avignon, they moved the capital of the Roman Catholic Church from the Vatican in Italy to, well, it technically wasn't France, it was the Kingdom of the Arles, A-R-L-E-S, but modern-day France. How is it they were able to buy the city of Avignon from the ancestors of the Plantagenets? If you know Shakespeare, you know the kingdom of or the dynasty of the Plantagenets is the 100 Years' War. How is it the whole city of Avignon was owned by a woman who was the queen of Naples in Italy, Joanna I? She didn't murder her husband, but he died and she was in the room next door. She didn't say anything. He actually died a very violent death. He was strangled to death, and they tied a rope around his genitals and threw him out the window. And it was his handmaid who actually cried for help and drove away the perpetrators. And then she took his body to the monastery and stayed with him overnight, mourning him. Not his wife, his butler-s. How do these things happen? And in order to understand that, we have to understand the political power the church gathered to itself and how that was pushed against by the King of France at that time. And we'll get there, but not today. We got to start with first the blooming or blossoming of political control by the church. All right, so there were two big swaths through history to kind of point to why we should understand some of these things. So again, I've got my little video here that kind of shows the movement of, or is it going? Did I stop it? Yeah, I guess I didn't do a good job copying that slide over. All right. Well, that was supposed to have been the animation from last week that showed by 476 the eastern part of the Roman Empire, that thing that was in pink right here, is still standing as a Roman Empire. They have an emperor or emperors, but in the west, they have divided into several different areas, and that was a result of folks from the north and the east pushing in and around, coming through North Africa and coming back up to Rome through Cyprus and Corsica, Sicily. And so all of this conquest because of weak leadership in the Western Roman Empire. I wanted to take two kind of quotations out of that development of the urban environment and just share those with you. They're a little bit longer, but I think they do a good job of kind of setting the stage or the context of what's going to happen in the fallen Western Roman Empire. The history of Rome in the early Middle Ages, that's the area we're looking for, is best understood as a continuous evolution from Rome of the Caesars to Rome of the popes, with the latter taking on many of the roles of their imperial predecessors. A critical moment occurs in the 7th and early 8th centuries when the physical, quote, landscape of the city is reinvented. Basically, the church took over all of the pagan temples, all of the pagan landmarks, and made those Christian. If you today go into some place that calls itself a church, and you see stained glass windows and statues, and the person who's up front officiating the service is in robes, that is not Christianity of the Bible. That is Christianity of Rome. That is making the church building look like a Roman temple or a Roman Senate building. You know, these beautiful Gothic architecture. That has nothing to do with trying to honor God. It's trying to make the church's building look official and look important like the Roman buildings did. Now, eventually, Christians thought they were honoring God by doing those things, but that is not how it started. So they transformed the pagan to Christian through an appropriation of the material vestiges of the ancient city, as well as aspects of ritual behavior, such as the development of the stational liturgy. Stational liturgy is you go from one church building to another church building. One is dedicated to Mary, another to Peter, another to Andrew, another to John. You know, why is St. Peter's Basilica St. Peter's Basilica? Isn't it Christ's church? Like why would we have a church dedicated to St. John? It's Christ's church. John is just a dude, you know, like, yeah, he was an apostle, and he was important, and he wrote these letters in this gospel to John, but he said he was the disciple. He didn't even name himself in his own gospel, right? Like, he did not clearly want us, you know, having churches in his name. Yet, that was a development. It was a development that was directly related to Roman pagan worship. We have a temple to Osiris and Diana and whatever. The Christian church appropriated those, that idea, and made that part of Christianity. And all my high church friends who, you know, have churches named the, you know, St. Luther, Mark's, John, Baptist, Fire of whatever, are shaking their head at me right now like, how dare you? But it's true. It really is true. So the landscape was imbued with memories and meaning, transmitters of the city's identity and history, and these understandings were, quote, Christianized, fulfilling the city's manifest destiny. And then a little later, that was on page 205, a few pages later, he continues to write, the period of the late 5th and 6th centuries, early 6th, so the late 400s, early 500s, right, the fall of Rome time, witnessed the complete disruption of the existing patterns of social and political life in Rome, the result of plagues, famine, and the significant population displacement occasioned by warfare. This phenomenon was much lamented at the time by Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, who evoked strong eschatological overtones. The old aristocratic families, many of whom had decamped to Constantinople, so the Roman senatorial class moved to where the capital was, during the Gothic Wars, faded into oblivion, as did the Roman Senate. And at the same time, we find the beginnings of a new aristocracy emerging from the military officers and their families who increasingly settled and became major landowners. So we have Roman senatorial class. They're the ones that have all the money and all of the power in Rome, the western part of the empire. As these Gothic people come across the northern European part and start pressing into Italy, they move to Constantinople, where they no longer have control over their estates. They're being overrun by these people. And not having these large government patterns resulted in difficulty to the life of the people that live there. Imagine you went to Kroger in Clifton Forge and tried to buy something, and they said, no, that is Covington money. We don't accept Covington money here in Clifton Forge. Well, when it was the Roman Empire, it was all Caesar's money, right? Jesus said it, render unto Caesar what is, well, when there's no Caesar, who's backing the dollar? Who's backing the currency? And how do you, as a person who's trying to get by, how do you buy and sell stuff when you've got all these Roman coins that don't matter anymore? Because there's no Caesar to back the coin. I mean, this is a difficult thing. You can imagine, and who's going to step into that void but the Knights Templar? Right? These Christianized warriors who, instead of you traveling from place to place with gold and silver, you can bring it to the monastery where the Knights Templar are. They will write you a note, and they'll write a matching note that they'll send with their group of knights. And so you get to where you're going, you get both letters together, and if you happen to get robbed and somebody takes your letter and they're not the person that the letter was assigned to, the Knights Templar would, you clearly have stolen this letter, so it does you no good to steal that money. And when you show up with your certificate, they give you that amount of money. They become the bankers, but they're the church. What about justice system? If I went to Clifton Forge and I had a issue of conflict between somebody in Covington, if there's no authority above those two, it doesn't matter that I say, you owe me this amount of money, person from Covington, if the authority in Clifton Forge is no good there in Covington. I can't make him pay or her pay. But if it's the state of Virginia, then they have authority over both places, right? And if it's the federal government, they have authority over Virginia and West Virginia. Well, when there's no federal government, what happens is there's no way to get justice, which is how when Martin Luther was condemned at the Diet of Worms, he just simply went to the castle of his prince, and he said, well, I'll just translate the Bible into German here. They can't touch me, right? He put his MC Hammer pants on, said, can't touch this, right? And he was fine and safe because there were ruptures in justice where you couldn't apply. What about the army? When these invaders are coming in, when you get to tax the entire region of the Western Roman Empire and feed and draw recruits from that whole area, you've got a huge army. But when it's just your little fiefdom, when it's the, Clifton Forge Armory against the United States Army or something, or, Mexico, we stand no chance. So your little army's power and ability to tax goes away. Same thing with police. If you have no federal justice system, no federal police group, how much more dangerous is it for you to travel from Clifton Forge to Covington, or in medieval Europe from one city to another city? Who's going to provide you protection on those? So people stopped leaving. They stopped traveling and they stayed in their own little place. Who would even keep up the roads and the bridges? There's no, overall system to make that happen. What about welfare and alms? These people who were getting daily handouts from the Roman government because they were importing tons of grain from Africa. Well, Africa is overrun by the Vandals. They're no longer getting shipments of grain from Alexandria into Rome. So how is Rome going to hand out alms to their people? And then the Roman government falls apart. What do these people do who used to be living on the welfare system of Rome? Well, what they have to do is they have to sell their kids basically into slavery, or they become what they call the feudal system. They become the serf of the major landowner, who is the Vandal or the Goth that came and took over that land. And their warriors who fought for them get to be the counts and the dukes over the different cities and farms. And so you, as a person, do not own the land that you're working. You work it as a vassal, as basically a slave, but you get the protection of that lord, that king, who has all these different cities that he has in charge of him. By the way, who owns their house here? By show of hands, who owns their house and their property? You think you own it? Don't pay your federal property tax. Tell me how long. You know what the real in real estate is from? It's real. It's royal. It means your property is still owned by the government, and for the cost of your taxes, you have the privilege of pretending you get to own it and earning a portion of the income on it when you sell it, and having the right at the right inheritance tax price to pass that on to your children. But you don't get to give it to your kids for free. You have to pay off the government for the right to do that. I don't know if you've ever thought of it that way, but that is honest to God what is happening. That comes from this period of time. Only they did not have the right to pass on their inheritance to their kids. The land was owned by the lord, the duke or the count, the comies or the dukies. And so this created three different kind of classes, or three orders, or three stations in society. There was those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who pray were the clergy, the popes, the bishops, the priests, the deacons, the monks. Those who fought were the dukes, the counts, the knights, and those who worked were the serfs. Now, don't think of serfdom as slavery. Think of it as tenure. The better job you do working your land, the less chance there is of your lord turning your land over to somebody else, right? You've got the privilege of working it. You've got the safety of not being overrun because you're under that guy's protection. So, and then this was life. What was life like for the average serf? Well, for the working class person, a male would be married around the age of 17 on average, and a woman would be married around the age of 13 on average. Typical family would have about 12 kids, somewhere between 10 to 14 children, but a woman had a 50% chance of surviving her first pregnancy. So 50-50 odds of living it through your first pregnancy. If you survived your first pregnancy, then you only had a 1 in 5 chance of dying from every subsequent child, about a 20% chance of dying during childbirth. There was no epidural pain medicine, right? When you needed surgery or dental work, they just did the surgery and the dental work, they'd hold you down and go for it, right? Typically, if you live to age 12, which only about 50% of kids made it to age 12, if you lived to age 12, you had a pretty good chance of living to 40 to 60 years old. So you think about your life. You don't own your land. You can't pass it on to your kids. You're hoping that the Lord you're working the land for is strong enough to protect you from invaders that come in. Your wife, who's 13, might die when she has her first kid, 50-50 odds, and you may not be able to afford a second wife after that, in which case you're destitute because you don't have enough laborers to work the land that you don't actually own. You can't read, you can't write, and you're probably going to die between 40 to 60 years old if you're a man. if a woman, your main job is to make sure you live and give birth, but also you got to work the family farm and take care of the house, raise and educate the kids. Educate meaning get them to where they understand what it means to work the land. Super hopeful, right? And we have this anachronistic pride about where we are, that we look back to then and we think they must have been so depressed and so sad because how bad their life was. That is snobbery. But what it did do is it does make the hope of heaven look so much better, right? The hope of streets paved with gold. And so people, would turn to Christianity because there wasn't much to be gained in this life. I think a part of what drives people out of Christianity is the lack of persecution and the abundance that is present in the world, in America today. It seems like you can be a millionaire with a yacht and as a 50-year-old man, you can have a whole bevy of 20-year-old ladies as long as you got enough money, and you can be a bajillionaire by playing video games on YouTube and, stupid things like this. It's like, oh, there's so much to be had. None of that opportunity existed for them. Many more people came to Christianity. So what's happening is these are the different groups that are coming in and invading. The Goths come in, and they're the red. And by the time they get to northeastern Europe there, they split into two groups, Ostrogoths and Visigoths. The Ostrogoths will cross the Black Sea and get to the Byzantine Empire, where they really don't have much impact. They will also go through this part of northern Turkey area and get down into Rome. The Visigoths come in and they actually beat the Huns at the Battle of Adrianople, and then they continue down through Greece and come over. Interestingly, Alaric, who was a Visigoth, was an Arian. He was not a Christian. He believed Jesus was a created being. He believed that because of Arian missionaries that came out of the Eastern Roman Empire. We're going to look at Ulrich here in a second. So as he's in northern Rome, he is not a Christian. He is not a Catholic. He's not Nicene in his faith. He does not believe in Jesus, who is God. He believes in a person named Jesus, who was the first created being. Now he goes over to Spain. He actually gets permission from Honorius, the bishop or the emperor in the Western Roman Empire, that he defeated when he sieged Rome in 410, when he sacked Rome in 410. He didn't find Rome something to be had, so he went back into the northern part of Italy and actually asked the guy he just defeated if he had permission to go into the further western part of Rome to get territory that was more farmable, more arable, by kicking out the Vandals. And Honorius is like, sure, dude, get out of my country, right? And so he goes over, but we think of Spain not being Arian. We think of Spain as being Roman Catholic. So how did this Arian conqueror end up becoming Catholic in Spain? I mean, that's a curious thing, right? How is it that these Huns, who were completely pagan, and these Vandals, who were completely pagan, end up Catholic, end up Christian, Nicene Christian? Well, one of the interesting things that happens is these dynasties of conquerors, we'll take a look at the Goths first, got married. So one of them was a guy named Merovich. You've probably heard of the Merovingian dynasty. That means sons of Merovich. They won control of Gaul, which is the area of France. Now that area had actually been converted to Arianism by a guy named Ulfilas in the 4th century, as well as the Vandals. But one of the children of Merovich, a guy named Clovis, married a woman, Clotilda. If you got, grandkids who are, need names, Clotilda, great name, who she was a Nicene Christian, and she tried to convert her husband to Christianity. In fact, she had to baptize 2 of her sons in private because her Arian husband, Clovis, would not. Well, Clovis made the mistake of leaving his empire, not to the oldest son, but to all 4 sons. Well, what does that do when you take power and you divide it by 4 and their siblings? They all think, well, I could do better than my brother, and I could do better than that brother. And so they begin fighting each other, and they've got less people they're in charge of, so their armies are smaller, so they're susceptible to invasion themselves because they don't work together, they work against each other. Well, Clovis does become a Christian. He leaves his kingdom to his 4 grandsons, and one of them was a guy named Sigebert the First. And she was an Arian Visigoth. Her name was Brunhilda. Again, fantastic name for those grandbabies. Well, Brunhilda is an Arian Visigoth, and she's going to go to war, basically, with one of her husband's, Clothar, one of his brothers. So Brunhilda is an Arian Visigoth. Her sister, Goswintha, is married to her husband's brother. So they're sisters, and they're married to brothers. You can't make this up, right? Days of our lives, sand through the hourglass. Well, he didn't like his wife. He strangled her to death. This is the tile there. And he decided, I wanted to marry instead my main gal, my main mistress, Fredegund. So we have 2 sisters married to 2 brothers. The one brother murders the sister, so the other sister's upset that her, I think, cousin, brother-in-law, uncle, and nephew all together. I'm not sure how that works, how all the different lines of kinship connect there. And so what she does is she brings her country to war against his country. And so what she does is she actually hires 2 assassins who stab him with poisoned knives and has her brother-in-law killed. Now, her husband actually dies. And so what she does is she marries the son of her husband's brother's first wife's son they had together, her nephew, Chilperic. Now, at the time she marries him, she was actually being held captive by her brother-in-law, who's still alive, right? Because he murdered his wife. She tried to have him killed. He finds out, so his mistress actually kills her husband. Well, through her intrigue and her marrying her nephew, she actually ends up controlling much of this dynastic area. And I'm illustrating this to you as just one of many stories that are like it that happen, to show that the control over this area is fractured and it is ineffective at leading the area. And who is left to fill that power void? The Catholic Church. And we're going to see these people are marrying Catholic women who are converting them to Christianity. And so they owe their loyalty to this one bishop in Rome because there's no other, bishops in the area that claim to have a patriarchy in the West. The Western Roman Emperor has already fallen. So she continued to control the dynasty, but her control was getting weaker and weaker, and she was getting older and older. And so the Merovingians had appointed another family to basically be their chief of staff, the Carolingians. Well, the Carolingians are friends with the Pope because they haven't gone to Nicene Christianity through Brunhilda. They've stayed Catholic. And so the Pope, at one point, actually just says, okay, the Carolingian guy is actually ruling the place. So the Merovingian guy, he can't be king because he's not doing a good job. It's really his wife. And he recognizes the Carolingian as the king. Well, everybody's upset about that, and they take it out on Broomhilda as a 70-year-old lady, have her dragged through the city by her hair until she dies, ties her up to horses, and has her ripped apart limb from limb. So, good times going on. But in the end, and they burned her bones too, just in case, everything up to that point wasn't enough. So a little bit violent. The Pope recognizes the Carolingians, and they take over. So these are things going on in the 5th century, right? That area of Rome, of the former Western Roman Empire, Gaul, is taken control of by one major family. They convert to Christianity, but then become Arian. Their chief of staff stay Catholic. They take over, and you have this rupturing of power because of the way power is transferred from father to all of the sons, instead of just to one son. Those are the Germanic inheritance rules, which will come up again later. So put that in your memory bank. They don't just give it to the heir, they give it to all the heirs, or they give it to the person they choose, which is actually what happened in the Western Roman Empire in the first place that led partly to its fall. Well, in the 6th century, barbarians, by the way, I didn't mention this last time, that word barbarian is a Greek-speaking person's word, or a Latin-speaking person's word. It is onomatopoeia, like pop, or bang, or meow, or bark. The word sounds like what it is. The barbarians' language sounded to have a lot of plosives, and the word was meant to mock their language, barbarian. So they were non-Greek and non-Latin speaking people from outside the Roman Empire. So when you hear barbarian, they're made up of various Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Lombards. The Lombards actually were in northern Italy by this point. So in the East, they're seeing all this stuff falling apart in what used to be Rome. And they're like, isn't that Rome? Shouldn't we be doing something about this? So Justinian, who, remember, he's the main dude that Eastern Orthodox Christianity centered their worship around during the 6th century. His reign is when they kind of formalized their... He goes and says, well, I better send armies to Rome and retake control of this western part of my empire. Well, what ended up happening is the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Vandals basically just wiped the floor with these Romans that were there and then turned on each other. And who is there to feed the poor and take in the widows and the orphans but the Catholic Church? And so they're assuming control. Who's there to, stabilize the currency? Who's there to sponsor arts and sciences? Who's there to appoint bishops in neighboring neighborhoods so people can actually get married, and their dead can be buried with a Christian burial, but the Bishop of Rome, and there's no emperor there to appoint him, so he's a man unto himself. And God, maybe. So these Arian Vandals persecuted Nicene Christians in North Africa, and I point this out that both North Africa and Spain had Arians who persecuted Catholic Christians, Nicene Orthodox Christians. And although there is no prophet of God to say that persecuting God's people is what resulted in their being persecuted by another nation, we see this pattern in the Old Testament, right? Some nation, the Assyrians, conquer northern Israel, God's people. So God uses the Syrians to conquer the Assyrians, or the Egyptians. He says, yes, I am using you, a nation, to punish my people for not being faithful, but I'm still going to punish you for not being... Well, this is pretty much exactly what happens throughout North Africa and Spain. These Arians, who are not Christians, now when you go and read the secular sources, they refer to them as Arian Christians. They don't see the difference. Arians are not Christians. They do not believe Jesus, the Christ is God. If you do not believe in God, you are not a Christian. I mean, the math is pretty easy on that one, right? It's not like a lesser view of Jesus. It is not Jesus. It's the Mormon God or the Jehovah's Witnesses God, little g, right? Not the dude. So, and that may be blasphemy saying it like that, so forgive me. Well, what happens is these areas in North Africa and Spain actually are the areas that get completely conquered by the Muslims. But the area where the Carolingians who stayed Catholic are the ones that were able to stand against and oppose and push back against the Muslims. They never switched to Arian faith. They became Catholic through Clotilda and stayed Catholic that way. And so they end up not being conquered. That's my theory, right? There's no scriptural basis for that besides that's a pattern that God had repeatedly used. There is no person today who is a prophet of God to have pronounced that. You know, all we have from God is written down now, right? And the application of that is the illumination of the Holy Spirit. The conviction of the truth of that is the Holy Spirit. That's my understanding. You know, you go to different congregations around here, they have, you know, maybe a little different view. But so that's what happens in the 6th century. So Arian Christianity, Arianism, is in Spain and North Africa. The Eastern European or the Eastern Roman Emperor is trying to retake Rome, but the chaos he's causing is actually just bolstering up power for the Roman bishop. Well, in the 7th century, Islam begins to shrink the borders of Byzantine and spread into North Africa. So Islam is a religion where the Prophet Muhammad experiences this vision in the desert. He's in Mecca. His family is there as the primary tribe to defend this pagan temple where the principal idol in that temple is a black stone. It's a meteorite, evidently. It used to be white, but the sins of man turned it black. They've got all kinds of myths that go along with it. But there are other idols to other gods. Muhammad says these other idols to these other gods, they're false gods. We need to purify this place. Well, his family is supposed to be protecting that place, so his family kicks him out, and he has to go to Medina. He makes converts in Medina, and he comes back to Mecca, and they want to kill him in Mecca, but his uncle provides protection over Muhammad until his uncle dies. Now, when his uncle is dying, Muhammad is telling him, you know, I'm the prophet of the one true God. You have to convert to Islam or you're going to be in hell forever. And I can't pray for you because you're not a Muslim. On the other side of the bed is this guy's family saying, you can't convert from your pagan gods or you'll, be destroyed in the afterlife. Well, he dies not having converted to Islam. But Muhammad, because he loved his uncle and he provided protection for him, was allowed to pray in that one circumstance for this one non-Islamic person. And because of Muhammad's prayer, his uncle gets the best place in hell, which means he's got shoes on so hot that his brains boil. This is all the sayings, the hadith of Islam. So this religion is a monotheistic religion. They believe in one God, Allah, and his prophet is Muhammad. If you say that in Islam and you believe it, you're an Islamic person. There's one God, Allah, and his prophet is Muhammad. You say it in Arabic, you believe it, you become a Muslim. You can say it in Islam and not believe it, no magic. Right? So, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be mocking them, though. This is pushing through North Africa, and eventually they're actually going to push into Spain. They're going to cross the Straits of Gibraltar. Actually, Gibraltar is it means rock of, I forget the guy's name, the Arabic leader of the army. When you say rock in Arabic and this guy's name and you say it real fast, it sounds like Gibraltar. That's literally a rock of the guy who, led those armies, whatever his name was. I didn't put notes down to give you any better detail. I'm sure with that, if you're curious, you can find it on the internet, meaning of Gibraltar. But we basically pay homage to this guy by calling it his rock every time we say the name in English, which is interesting and we don't really think about. Well, as this is happening, we see that Anglo-Saxon England, I mentioned Alaric the Visigoth sacking Rome in 410. Well, the Roman armies, the legions that they had in Britain, had to turn around and come out of Britain to defend Rome. Well, that left Britain wide open for invasion by the Angles and the Saxons. I'll go back to this drawing right here. See the yellow lines? That's happening because in 410, Rome is being conquered and invaded and sacked by Alaric the Visigoth. So the people from Ireland, the Gaels, can come over. The Angles and the Saxons can come over. In a little bit, the Vikings are going to come over too, but we got to wait a century for that. Well, when that's happening, the Christian mission that went to Britain, right, formed the bishopric at Canterbury. Well, the only people who were Christian really were the Romans, and they've all pretty much left. And there's a global cooling that's happening at this time, so you can't grow grapes in Britain anymore. It's not good farmland. Rome does not care about Britain. And so there aren't a lot of Christians remaining in Britain. Well, in 595, Gregory I, who is getting all this power in Rome, decides we better go re-Christianize Britain. And so he sends a mission to Kent in 595. Why? Because the king in Britain's wife, Bertha, again, if you got babies that need names, history is full of fantastic ones. She had been the daughter of the Merovingian king, Caribert I. So she converts her husband, and I didn't write his name down. I did, Aethelbert. She converts him to Christianity, so he appeals to the Pope to send us a bishop so we can practice our religion here. And he does. Actually, he doesn't convert and ask. He asks on behalf of his wife. The Pope sends the bishop, and then he converts when the bishop gets there. And also in the 7th century, the Venerable Bede writes actually it's the Ecclesial History of the English People is the actual name of the translated name, because it's in early English, so you couldn't actually read it in English. So that's going on in Britain. During the 8th century, these are the 700s, Islamic armies had conquered all the way through Spain into Gaul, but by the time they get to Tours, Charles the Hammer, who we talked about before, is able to withstand the Islamic armies. And it's a fascinating battle about the Battle of Tours. Basically, Charles Martel had his infantry hide in the woods to hide their real size, and they got the high ground. The Moorish invaders were almost all cavalry, and so they're on horses trying to charge uphill to an unknown size of defenders. So as they kind of wait and play chicken with each other, or what's the game where you line up and hold hands and you call the person over where they're supposed to break through, a playground game. You taunt one another and try. Anyhow, they didn't just go into big war. It's not like you see on Mel Gibson's movie, Freedom, like big armies all go together. They would have little local skirmishes. You would try to break their supply lines. You didn't want to just get all your people killed all at once, right? Like that wasn't good strategy. Well, so they're doing this. Red Rover, that's the name of the game. Red Rover, yeah, right, exactly. Whomever come over. So eventually the cavalry decides, okay, they're never coming. We're just going to go. So they launch into this attack, and Charles Martel, as you may remember, had actually been able to train his army year-round. He didn't have to break them up over the summer to go farm because he was getting support from the Pope. So he could train his army. So they did not break. And in fact, they started coming out of the trees and showing their actual size. They were widely outnumbered by the Arabs, but not as widely as the Arabs thought. And then the Arabs are like, well, if they've been hiding in the trees, maybe they've flanked us. And maybe they're back at our home base where our supplies are. So they turned around. Now, Charles Martel thought it was a trap, and so he kept his army in the woods for days. Meanwhile, the Arabs thought they had been beaten and they went back home. And Charles Martel comes out. He's like, oh, we won. Cool. Well, this took on kind of a life of its own. Look, the Christians finally defeated the Arabs, the Muslims. And so here we have a picture of how far the Arabic expansion had gotten by the middle of the 8th century, by 750. The white area up through Toledo and Barcelona shows you how far they had gotten. You can see all the way over to the east there. They're well past India, well into the Asian continent. So huge, huge movement. So the Viking expansion began at this time. All of your forces in Europe, they're focused on the battle with the Moors on the western side. So global cooling is happening. And so the Vikings are like, we need meat and fish and cheese and women, right? Nobody really knows exactly why the Viking expansion happened, but it did. And these are the areas that they went to. The dark kind of red is the 8th century. The lighter red in the middle there is the 9th. 10th century, they get all the way to Russia. 11th century, they get over to England. They actually have conquered, by sailing all the way around into the Mediterranean, the lower part of Italy's boot, Sicily, the Horn of Africa. And they actually made it to North America at this time. Leif Erikson, or whatever his name is, like he's the first Europeaner dude that we know of who actually made it to the new continent, which is fascinating. And green were frequent Viking raids, but they never actually established a settlement. But you notice up here in Normandy, where this orange is, this is very important because they're going to set up a Norse king. William the Conqueror is one of the ancestors of that Norse king. And he's actually going to take over England. And he's going to take over this green area on the western part of France. And they're going to become that kingdom of the Plantagenets, right? They're going to set off the 100 Years' War. So going to be important for history. So we don't really know why the Viking expansion happened, but there have been several theories that have been put forth. They either needed women because they had a lot of sons. They were possibly invading as a revenge for Christianizing that had happened. The Viking religion is very interesting. They may have had what they call a youth bulge, which meant that they just had a lot of children. They needed land for places for them to go. But what I think is, as the West destabilized and trade failed and army forces had to all go to the western frontier to prevent the invasion of the Arabs, that meant there was no trade happening, which was a big part of the seafaring people's livelihood. The first targets of the Viking expansion were actually Christian monasteries in England that had just been set up 100 years before by Gregory I, which is pretty interesting. And that actually, those Christian monasteries in England are where we get these beautiful Celtic-looking, drawings of the Gaelic crosses. Because the Gaels had invaded England as the Romans pulled out of England. They brought their Gaelic culture and their Gaelic art and their Gaelic language. Incidentally, these words that we have in English that are SK words, Scandinavian words, like skull, those come from the influence of that Viking invasion and their language. So has nothing to do with church history, but the next time you pick a scab, you can thank a Viking for naming it for you. All right, that's enough weirdness. During the 9th century, the Bishop of Rome had hitched his wagon to the Carolingians. He crowns Charlemagne on Christmas Day 800. Remember, he had up to this point, the bishop in Rome, relied on the approval, if not the direct appointment by the Eastern Roman bishop to office, or Eastern Roman emperor to his office. all of a sudden it looks like this guy Charlemagne, who's the grandson of Charles Martel, who defeated the Islamic invasion and is beginning to expand his territory, this guy might be strong enough to provide the military might the church needs to go forward. So he hitches his wagon. He crowned spontaneously on Christmas Day in Old St. Peter's Basilica Charlemagne as the emperor of the new Western Holy Roman Empire, which was not seen as Western, it was seen as only the Roman Empire. And historians have noted it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. That guy's crown, the Holy Roman Emperor's crown, was the crown, the authority that was used to condemn Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms. The Carolingian Renaissance, because of the ability now, they were big enough, they had enough military might to suppress all these wars, that they began to have a minor renaissance in sciences and art. It was known as the Carolingian Renaissance. And Charlemagne had a palace built at Aachen, which there's some remains for today, that it was absolutely enormous and important. They had a scriptorium there that basically they made copies of every known important writing, and then they would send the important writing back. That way they could preserve it. If you were a scholar and you needed to know, something that was written down from the ecclesial history of the church or of the English people, you would bet that there'd be a copy of it at that scriptorium. It was the new Library of Alexandria. And in this palace, they had a Christian cathedral built. But on the upper floor of that cathedral, there was a balcony where Charlemagne would sit over the church. And so this is going to be a point of conflict that's now going to come up. The Pope appointed the Charlemagne as the emperor, but he's sitting in the upper balcony over the bishop in his church, and this conflict of power is going to rear its ugly head in the centuries to come. While this is happening, and you've got kids and they have no hope of inheriting anything, how are they going to move up from that third estate, the working people, up the ladder? It's not like the Roman Empire where they have councils and consuls and generals. And, if you're an intelligent, capable, gifted person that you can move up in society, there's no up movement in society apart from the church. And you could become a monk. And the church would be the lord over that property. And they would actually have vassals, serfs, that would farm the land for the monastery. If you were a woman who had a child and your husband died, who was going to, provide protection for you and income for you? You've seen The Sound of Music, right? The lady that goes to the Von Trapp family. She's not a nun, but she wears the hood thing. I can't remember the habit of a proselyte, of a pre-converting person. She is in the nunnery getting protected because she was, I guess, a bad child, and they were waiting to see, is she going to be, reformed and be a good nun, or is she going to be, and they're like, no, you go find work, right? And she goes to the Von Trapp family and, makes clothing out of drapes and sings to the mountains of whatever. So this is where this all comes from. This is where this sheltering, and in the monasteries, because these guys aren't working the land, they now have the opportunity to begin to sit and read and study and learn, and they begin to ask questions that seem obtuse to us. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But the content behind it is, do angels have extension into space and time, or do they kind of exist on a different plane? And so the ability to sit and ponder those things, because you're not starving to death hoping your potatoes make it this year, is an important innovation for society, where the federal overhead of the Caesar government has completely fallen apart. So that is life in Western Roman Empire. Next week, we're going to take a look at St. Patrick's, and the week after that, we're going to look at what was this rule of St. Benedict that establishes this life inside of the monasteries. Any questions? Is it too much? Too little? We can go deeper. All right, God bless you guys. We'll see you at 10:30 for service. Did you get yourself a communion cup, Charlie?